The morning Florence Maddox rode up to the Bailey Ranch with a stranger's horse in tow. She had no idea that the simple act of returning something that did not belong to her would change the entire course of her life. The summer of 1882 had settled over the Texas Panhandle like a wool blanket soaked in heat, thick and suffocating, and relentless in its weight. The land stretched in every direction without apology, flat and golden and enormous, broken only by the occasional rise of a limestone ridge or the twisted silhouette of a mesquite tree, reaching its gnarled arms toward a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at directly. Florence had lived on the edge of this land her whole life, 24 years of red dust and hard work, and the particular kind of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by nothing but horizon. She knew this country the way she knew her own hands, every crack and callus, every familiar roughness. And yet somehow, on that Tuesday morning in early July, the land managed to surprise her. She had been riding out before dawn, as was her habit in the summers when the heat became a living thing that waited at the edge of noon to devour whatever foolish creature had not yet found shade. Her own horse, a steady roan mare named Clementine, had carried her along the dry creek bed that ran south of her father's property, a modest spread of 40 acres that produced just enough to keep the two of them fed and the bank from knocking too insistently at the door. Her father, Thomas Maddox, was a quiet man who had never quite recovered from her mother's passing 7 years prior, and in the years since, it had fallen to Florence to manage most of the practical affairs of their small homestead. She did not resent this. It was simply how things were, and Florence had long since made her peace with how things were. She had been thinking about the water trough that needed mending on the south fence when she heard it. A sound that did not belong, a soft rhythmic plodding coming from the wrong direction, from the open grassland to the east where there was nothing for 3 miles but scrub and sky. She reined Clementine to a stop and turned in her saddle, shielding her eyes against the pale gray light of early morning. And there it was. A horse coming toward her at an easy wandering walk, its head hanging low in the way that horses do when they are tired and directionless and no longer certain what they are looking for. Florence clicked her tongue and waited. The horse approached without alarm, which told her something about its temperament and its history. It was a fine-looking animal even in its current state of dusty dishevelment, a deep bay stallion with a black mane and tail, and 4 perfectly matched white stockings that climbed to mid-cannon on each leg. Good breeding, she could see that clearly. Someone had put money and care into this animal before something had gone wrong. There was a saddle still on its back, though it had shifted and listed badly to one side, and the reins were broken and trailing in the dirt. No rider in sight, no sound of anyone calling out, no boot prints in the soft creek mud that suggested anyone had been nearby recently. Florence dismounted and approached the bay carefully, speaking in a low voice the way her father had taught her. The horse snuffled at her hand and accepted her touch with a kind of exhausted relief, as though it had been carrying its aloneness for quite some time and was glad to set it down. She checked the saddle for markings. On the right fender, burned into the leather in clear letters, she found what she was looking for: Bailey. And beneath it, a brand she did not immediately recognize but which she thought she had seen once or twice on cattle that grazed the larger pastures to the north. She tied the bay's broken reins to her saddle horn with a length of spare rope she kept coiled at her hip, the way any sensible person who rode these plains learned to do, and turned Clementine north. Her water trough could wait another day. A man's horse could not wander these plains indefinitely. There were ravines enough to break a leg, and enough distance between places that a horse without a rider could cover an alarming amount of ground before anyone thought to look. The Bailey Ranch, she recalled as she rode, was some 8 miles to the north and a little east. She had never been there herself, though she knew of it the way you know of things in a sparsely settled country, through overheard conversation at the general store in Harlow, through the accounts that travel as naturally as water through the channels of small community life. The Bailey spread was one of the larger operations in the county, nearly 3,000 acres by the accounts she had heard, running cattle on open range, and doing well enough at it to have a reputation that reached even the modest ears of families like the Maddoxes. She knew there had been a Nathan Bailey who ran the place now, having taken it over from his father some years back. That was the extent of her knowledge. A name, a direction, and a vague sense of prosperity she had never had cause to investigate more closely. The sun had climbed past its early morning mercy and was working seriously at the sky by the time she saw the ranch buildings ahead. The main house was larger than she had expected, 2 stories of weathered timber and stone with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides, the kind of house that had been built with intention rather than necessity, by someone who had looked at the land and decided they intended to stay. Behind it spread a complex of outbuildings, a large barn, several smaller sheds, a bunkhouse, corrals built from cedar posts sunk deep in the rocky earth. There were cattle visible in the distance, a dark moving mass against the pale grass, and nearer at hand, a man working at the corral fence with a hammer. He looked up when he heard the horses. He was perhaps 30, maybe a year or 2 past it, tall in the way of men who have spent their lives outdoors, with shoulders that suggested regular honest work rather than vanity. His hair was dark and needed a cut, curling slightly at his collar in the heat, and his face was the color of sun-worked copper, angular and weathered in a way that suited the land around him. He set down his hammer and pushed his hat back on his head and looked at her, and then at the bay horse she was leading, and something in his face shifted from professional assessment to a more complicated emotion she could not immediately name. He came toward her at an unhurried walk that was nevertheless purposeful, the walk of a man who was accustomed to moving between points without wasting motion, and she dismounted before he reached her, because it seemed the right thing to do. "Morning," he said, stopping a few feet away. His eyes went directly to the bay. "That is Rio. I found him wandering along the South Creek bed this morning," Florence said. She had rehearsed this slightly on the ride over, not because she was nervous, but because she believed in being clear and efficient. About 3 miles east of the Maddox property, which runs along the South Fork, he had shifted his saddle and his reins were broken, but he does not appear to be injured. The man, Nathan Bailey, she assumed, walked to the bay's side and ran his hands along the horse's neck and down each leg with the practiced efficiency of someone who has tended horses all his life. He lifted each hoof briefly, checked the horse's gums, looked into its eyes. Then he straightened and looked at her with an expression she could only describe as quietly grateful, though he kept it carefully contained. "Rio has been missing since day before yesterday," he said. "I had 3 men out looking for him yesterday and this morning." He paused. "You rode 8 miles to bring him back." "The saddle has your name on it," Florence said simply. Nathan Bailey looked at her for a moment in the way that men sometimes look at women when they are recalibrating their expectations, adjusting some internal picture to account for something they had not anticipated. It was not unpleasant. Then the corner of his mouth lifted very slightly, not quite a smile but the ancestor of one. "That was a good piece of riding for a hot morning," he said. "Can I offer you water and something to eat?" Florence had water in her canteen and biscuits in her saddlebag, and ordinarily she would have said so and politely declined and turned Clementine back toward home. But the heat was genuine and the ride back would be long, and there was something about the directness of his offer that did not feel like the elaborate social performance that courtesy sometimes devolved into in polite company. It felt honest, so she said yes. He led her to the porch and called out to a boy of perhaps 14 who came running from the direction of the barn and was dispatched with Rio and both horses, and a set of instructions delivered in a tone that was firm but not unkind. Then Nathan Bailey opened the front door and stood aside, and Florence walked into the interior of the house, which was cool and dim after the blazing exterior morning. The house was not what she had expected, not the spare functional interior of a working man's home, nor the overcrowded fussiness she associated with households where a woman had been given too much time and too little actual work. It was somewhere between those two things, lived in and honest, with good furniture that had been chosen for durability, and the occasional unexpected piece that suggested someone in this household had opinions about beauty. There was a painting on the wall of the main room, a landscape that she recognized as the canyon country to the south, not professionally executed but genuinely felt. There were books on a low shelf near the window, perhaps 24 of them, which surprised her pleasantly. "Is there a Mrs. Bailey?" she asked, because it was the practical thing to establish before she made assumptions about whose home this was. She asked it plainly, without embarrassment. "There is not," Nathan said, equally plain. "There was. She passed 3 winters ago. Fever." "I am sorry," Florence said, and meant it. "So am I," he said, and moved into the kitchen, where sounds of a woman at work could be heard. He returned shortly with a glass of water so cold it must have come from the stone cistern underground, and a plate of food that turned out to be considerably more substantial than she had been prepared for. She sat at the long table and ate and drank, and they talked in the careful way of two people who are strangers but not, quite, feeling like strangers. He asked about the Maddox property, and she told him about her father and the 40 acres and the water trough she had been on her way to inspect. He told her about Rio, about how the horse had gotten through a gate that should have been latched and set off on one of his periodic explorations of the surrounding country, a habit that Nathan attributed with a dry affection to what he called the horse's excessive curiosity about the world. "He has done it before?" Florence asked. "Twice. The first time we found him in a neighbor's kitchen garden, eating everything he could reach. The second time he traveled 15 miles south before someone caught him." Nathan looked at his glass. "He is a very good horse in most respects. He came to me willingly," Florence offered. "He did not seem frightened, just tired. He trusts people," Nathan said, "which is a quality that serves him poorly on the open range." She thought about that for a moment. Outside, through the window, the heat was shimmering above the corral fence and a hawk was making long, lazy circles above the distant pasture. The woman in the kitchen, who turned out to be a Mrs. Delphine Harker, a widow of 50 who cooked for the ranch and had been with Nathan's family for 12 years, brought coffee without being asked and gave Florence an appraising look that was neither unfriendly nor overly curious, just the look of a competent woman assessing another competent woman. "You ought to keep Rio," Nathan said then, somewhat abruptly, as though the thought had arrived fully formed and he had decided to simply say it. Florence looked at him. "I beg your pardon." "Keep the horse," he said again. He was not joking. She could see that immediately. His face was serious in the way that serious men are when they have made a decision and are simply waiting for the world to catch up to it. "He is too much trouble to keep penned, and I have 7 other horses that do not develop wandering impulses. He clearly found his way to you. That seems like something." "That seems like a horse that found a creek bed," Florence said. "Maybe," Nathan said, "but I would like you to have him." Florence studied him. She was not accustomed to gifts, and she did not receive them without scrutiny. This was not suspicion exactly, more the measured habit of a woman who had learned that things which appeared freely offered sometimes carried concealed weight. But there was nothing in Nathan Bailey's expression that suggested calculation. He simply looked like a man who had arrived at what seemed to him a reasonable conclusion and was offering it. "That is a very fine horse," she said, "worth considerable money." "Yes," he agreed, which she appreciated. He did not pretend otherwise. "I cannot accept a gift like that from someone I do not know," she said. He was quiet for a moment. The hawk outside the window made another lazy circle. "Come back tomorrow," he said. "Then you will know me somewhat better. After that, if you still think it is too much, you can make that decision with more information." She looked at him steadily. He looked back. There was something in that exchange that went a little beyond the conversation itself. something she felt but did not yet have language for, a sense of two things becoming briefly and unexpectedly adjacent in a way that might matter. "I will think about it," she said, which was not yes and was not no and was therefore, she told herself, entirely practical. She rode home in the full afternoon heat with the sound of his voice still moving quietly through her thoughts, and when she arrived and unsaddled Clementine and went inside to check on her father, she found herself thinking about the bay horse with his white stockings and his habit of going places he had not been invited, and about the man on the porch who had watched her ride away and said nothing further, which somehow felt like more than he could have said. Thomas Maddox was sitting at the kitchen table with the newspaper that had come from Amarillo 3 days ago, which was how long it generally took the Amarillo paper to reach Harlow, and then to be carried out to the Maddox property by whoever happened to be going that direction. He was 61 years old and looked it in some ways, and did not in others. A lean, quiet man with Florence's same gray eyes and her same quality of stillness when he was thinking. "You were gone longer than the water trough needed," he observed, without looking up. "I found a wandering horse," Florence said, and told him about it. Her father listened in his way without interrupting, folding the newspaper slowly. When she finished, he said, "Nathan Bailey, I have heard of him, fair man by accounts." "He wanted to give me the horse," Florence said. Thomas Maddox looked at her then. He had an expression she recognized, the one that meant he was being careful with his words, measuring them for weight before letting them out. "What did you say?" "I said I would think about it," Florence said. "He said come back tomorrow." "Yes. And will you?" Florence moved to the window and looked out at the yard, at Clementine in the small corral, at the flat land running out in every direction under the afternoon light. She was quiet for a moment, honest with herself in the way she tried always to be. "I think so," she said. She went back the next morning. She told herself it was because the situation required resolution, that she needed to give the man a clear answer about the horse rather than leaving the matter hanging in the particular uncomfortable way that undefined things have of hanging. She told herself this was practical. She told herself the earlier start would help her beat the worst of the heat. She arrived at the Bailey Ranch to find Nathan Bailey in the corral working a young horse, a gray 2-year-old with more opinions than experience, and she stood at the fence and watched for a while without announcing herself, which was not deceptive but simply a consequence of his concentration and the noise the colt was making. He worked the horse with quiet patience, a series of small, consistent communications that gradually replaced the animal's alarm with attention, then with cooperation. She found herself watching his hands, the way they moved, economical and certain, never punishing and never hesitating. He noticed her eventually, or perhaps he had been aware of her from the beginning and had simply chosen to finish what he was doing, which she respected. He led the gray to the far side of the corral and came to the fence and rested his arms on the top rail and looked at her. "You came back," he said. He sounded pleased but not triumphant, which was an important distinction. "I told you I would think about it," she said. "I thought about it. And I think," she said slowly, "that a gift like that requires something to stand on. It requires the kind of acquaintance that makes the exchange make sense. I'm not comfortable accepting a horse worth what that horse is worth from someone whose name I learned yesterday." "That is fair," Nathan said. "So I am willing to come back," she continued, "over whatever time seems reasonable, until we know each other well enough that whatever you decide to offer or not offer has some foundation under it." She paused. "That is not a negotiation about the horse. It is a statement about how I do things." Nathan looked at her for a long moment. The young gray behind him stamped a foot and swished his tail at a fly. Somewhere in the barn, someone was whistling a tune she did not recognize. "I would like that very much," Nathan said. "Come back as often as suits you. Stay as long as is comfortable. I will not push in any direction." "Good," Florence said. "Then I will stay for a while this morning if that is all right." It was more than all right, she could see, though he kept his expression settled and easy. He unlatched the corral gate and held it for her, which was a courtesy, and she walked through it and they went together to look at Rio, who was in the far corral eating with the full absorption of a horse that has been hungry and is now not. And they stood at the fence and talked about horses, and then about cattle, and then about the water situation in the county, which was a constant and genuine concern for everyone in the Panhandle. She stayed until mid-morning. She stayed again the next time she came, 3 days later, and the time after that. July turned around itself in the heat, and Florence found that her rides north had become a fixed point in her week, something she looked forward to with a quiet intensity. She examined carefully and honestly in the privacy of her own thoughts, and found she was not inclined to diminish. Nathan Bailey was a man of considerable intelligence and very few unnecessary words. He said what he meant and did not elaborate beyond what was useful, but what he said was often worth listening to, and he asked questions that suggested he was genuinely interested in the answers rather than merely performing interest. He asked about her mother and she told him, about the fever that had taken Margaret Maddox in the winter of 1875, about the particular silence that had settled into the house afterward and never entirely lifted. He listened in the way that good listeners do, without hurrying her toward resolution or offering comfort she had not asked for. She asked about his wife, whose name had been Clara. He talked about her without flinching, which she had not expected and which moved her considerably. He said that Clara had been the one who painted the landscape that hung in the main room, and that she had been funny in a dry way that sneaked up on you, and that she had been the better judge of cattle of the two of them, which he said without self-deprecation and without sentiment, simply as a fact he had found to be true. He said that losing her had been the kind of loss that reorganizes everything, the way a flood reorganizes a field, and that you learned to plant differently afterward, but you did not stop planting. Florence thought about that for a long time after she rode home that evening. She thought about it while she made supper and while she sat on the porch with her father in the cooling dark, listening to the night insects begin their conversations. "You are going up there quite often," her father said. "I am," Florence agreed. "Is it just about the horse?" Florence was quiet for a moment. The stars were extraordinary out here, away from any town light, a density of them that never became ordinary no matter how many years you lived under them. "No," she said, "not just." Her father nodded once and said nothing further, which was its own kind of wisdom. August came and the heat did not relent. The grass turned the color of old straw, and the creek beds ran lower, and the ranchers in the county began to have the careful, watchful look of people who are watching their resources and calculating. Nathan rode the range with his men every day, checking on the cattle, monitoring water sources, making decisions about where to move the herd. Florence sometimes arrived to find him gone and waited on the porch with Mrs. Harker, who had by now accepted her presence with the comfortable ease of someone who had simply incorporated Florence into the existing order of things. Mrs. Harker told her about the ranch's history, about Nathan's father, James Bailey, who had come to the Panhandle in 1868 with $200 and a strong back, and had built the spread through 20 years of brutal consecutive effort. About Nathan, who had been born in Kansas during the long drive north his parents had made before his father had stopped moving, and decided the Texas grasslands were where he meant to die. About Clara, who had arrived from Tennessee to marry Nathan at the age of 22, and had taken to the ranch life with a fierce practical joy that Mrs. Harker still spoke of with obvious affection. And about the 3 years since, during which Nathan had run the ranch with complete competence and without any apparent interest in his own happiness, which Mrs. Harker mentioned with the pointed casualness of a woman who has opinions and is choosing her moments for them. Nathan returned one afternoon to find Florence helping Mrs. Harker with the canning, which had become necessary as the kitchen garden came in with its August abundance. He stood in the kitchen doorway looking at Florence with a jar in each hand and a smear of tomato on her wrist, and something crossed his face that was so quickly contained that she almost missed it. But she did not miss it. They ate supper together that evening, the three of them, and afterward Nathan walked Florence to the corral where Clementine was waiting, and they stood in the last light of the day talking about nothing in particular. The sky was doing the thing it does in Texas at the end of summer days, turning colors that seem excessive, pinks and oranges that bleed into each other with a kind of reckless generosity. "I want to tell you something," Nathan said. Florence waited. "I am not a man who says things he does not mean," he said. "That has been my whole life. I do not offer what I do not intend." He paused, and she could see that he was choosing words carefully, which she had learned was what he did when something mattered to him particularly. "I enjoy your company more than I have enjoyed any company in a long time. I think you are one of the most genuine people I have ever met, and I think you are remarkable, and I am aware that this might be too early to say, and I am saying it anyway because I do not believe in letting things go unsaid that are true." Florence looked at him. The last of the sunset was behind his head, and she thought that years from now she would remember exactly this moment, the smell of the summer grass and the sound of the horses and the particular quality of his face in that dying light, open and serious and entirely without performance. "It is not too early," she said, "and I think similarly about you, in case that was not apparent." "It was becoming apparent," he said, and the corner of his mouth lifted, and she laughed, and the sound of her laughing in the evening seemed to surprise them both slightly, a bright and honest thing in the cooling air. He did not reach for her hand or try to kiss her, because he was a man who understood the value of patience and the importance of things happening in the order they were meant to happen, and she was grateful for this in a way she did not immediately say, but thought she would eventually. She rode home in the lavender dusk, feeling something she did not try to name precisely, only held it, the way you sometimes hold something beautiful loosely in both hands, because you understand that gripping it too tightly is the surest way to damage it. September brought a change in the air, a slight softening at the edges of the heat that announced autumn's eventual intentions, still weeks away but no longer theoretical. Florence began bringing things when she came, small practical contributions that could not be refused because they were framed as exchanges rather than gifts. She brought a jar of the preserved peaches she had put up from the tree behind the house, which turned out to be something Nathan ate with an enthusiasm that was entirely unguarded. She brought a new wooden-handled all she had traded for at the general store in Harlow, when she noticed the one hanging in Nathan's workshop was cracked nearly through. She brought herself, which was the most consistent and the most significant thing, and Nathan received her arrival every time with the same contained pleasure that she had come to watch for because it was so reliably honest. He showed her the ranch in sections, riding out together on various mornings or afternoons, covering the pastures and the fence lines and the places where the land did particular things that he had noticed and wanted to share. He showed her a limestone overhang near the northwest boundary, where cliff swallows nested every spring and left mud-cup homes along the rock in elaborate congregations. He showed her a spring that ran clear even in drought, fed by something deep in the earth that the surface weather could not quite reach, ringed by cottonwood trees that were already beginning to show the first pale yellow of the coming season. He showed her where the buffalo had been, indicated not by the animals themselves, but by the wallows still visible in the earth, great shallow depressions where the herds had rolled and marked the ground with their weight before the world changed, and they disappeared. He talked about this quietly and seriously, without romanticizing and without dismissing. The buffalo were gone because men had killed them deliberately, he said, to break the way of life of the Comanche and the Kiowa people who had relied on them. And he said this plainly as a fact about what the land had witnessed, and Florence listened and thought about the history of the ground beneath their horses' feet, all the things it had known before they arrived. She appreciated that he said these things. She had grown up hearing dismissals and justifications, and the particular blindness That comes from wanting very badly for the story you are living in to be a straightforward good one. Nathan did not seem to require that particular comfort. He looked at things with both eyes, and she found this made her trust him more completely than she had trusted almost anyone. They were sitting under the cottonwood trees at the spring on a morning in late September, the horses drinking and the early autumn light coming through the yellowing leaves in shifting coins of gold, when Nathan reached over and very deliberately took her hand in both of his and looked at her with the same careful directness he brought to everything. "I would like to court you properly," he said. "Which I recognize I have been doing for 2 months now without saying so explicitly. I am saying so now." "I would like that," Florence said. "I would also like to tell you that I understand if that leads nowhere," he said. "I have no interest in placing any obligation on you. I only want to be honest about where I stand, which is that I would very much like this, what has been happening between us over these months, to become something more." Florence looked down at his hands holding hers. They were large, calloused, capable hands, marked by the work they had done but gentle in the way they held her, careful without being tentative. "Nathan," she said, "I came back the second morning because of you, not because of any horse. I have come back every time since because of you. I think we are a good deal further along than you might be assuming." He looked at her for a moment with something in his face she had not seen before, a kind of relief mixed with something warmer and more complicated, and then he squeezed her hands gently. "Then I am a very fortunate man," he said quietly. They rode back to the ranch in a comfortable silence that was different from all the previous silences, richer, carrying more. October arrived with a rattle of dry leaves and a wind from the north that smelled of distance. Florence was at the ranch the morning one of Nathan's hands came riding in hard, a young man named Cooper Reese, who managed the southernmost cattle operation, with news that a section of fence on the east boundary had been knocked down, presumably by a small group of longhorns that had strayed across from the adjacent land, and in leaving had taken out 40 feet of cedar post fencing. Nathan was on his horse before Cooper had finished speaking, organizing his men with the quick efficiency of someone who has managed a large operation long enough to know that speed is itself a form of care. He looked at Florence. She was already standing next to Clementine. "You do not need to ride out for this," he said. "I know," she said, "but I am going to if you do not object." He did not object. He smiled very briefly and they rode. The fence repair took most of the day. Florence worked alongside Nathan's hands without ceremony, holding posts while they were reset, passing wire, doing what was useful without needing to be told what was useful, which was a quality that his cowboys seemed to take in and recalibrate their opinion of women generally around, though she was not doing it for that reason. She was doing it because the fence needed to be fixed and she had hands. Cooper Reese, who was 22 and from Mississippi, and had a habit of stating things about women that he had constructed from very limited experience, was quiet for most of the afternoon in a thoughtful way that suggested some revision happening in his understanding of the world. By the end of the day he was talking to her normally, and she thought that was probably the best outcome available. Riding back in the late afternoon with the wind picking up from the north and everyone dusty and tired, Nathan rode beside her close enough that their horses were nearly shoulder to shoulder, and he looked across at her with a warmth in his expression that was by now familiar and never less than moving. "You are a remarkably useful person," he said. "Thank you," she said. "So are you. I was not expecting that today." "You should begin to expect that kind of thing," she said, "if this is the direction you say you want to go." "I will adjust my expectations accordingly," he said, and the ease of it, the humor and the honesty together, made her feel something that she finally named to herself that evening as she rode home in the dark, the stars beginning their nightly abundance above her. She was in love with him. She had been moving toward it for weeks and she was now fully arrived. She did not say it to her father that night, not because she was concealing it, but because it was still new to her in its stated form, and she wanted to carry it privately for one more day, while she grew accustomed to its shape. She said it to herself, quietly, in the dark of her room with the wind moving the curtain at the window. She said it without surprise or alarm, because it felt exactly like what it was, the natural arrival of something that had been traveling toward her for months and had finally made its way home. Nathan came to the Maddox property for the first time on a Saturday in late October. He had asked if he might, and Florence had said yes, and had told her father, who had trimmed his beard for the occasion without mentioning that he was doing so. Thomas Maddox shook Nathan Bailey's hand on the porch and assessed him in the way that quiet men do, with a silence that asked questions without words, and Nathan stood it without discomfort, because he did not have the kind of guilt that makes the silence of an honest man feel like accusation. They sat on the porch in the afternoon cool, and Thomas asked about the ranch and Nathan answered. And Thomas asked a few questions about Nathan's father, whom it turned out Thomas had met once at a county meeting some years back and had a good impression of. And Nathan said that his father had been a better man than he himself expected to become, but that he was working at it, which made Thomas Maddox look at him for a second time with slightly different eyes. Florence made coffee and brought it out and sat with them, and the conversation moved to the county's water situation again, which was everyone's current concern, and then to the coming winter, and she watched her father find Nathan and watched Nathan find her father with the same gentle directness he brought to everything, and felt something very full and warm settle in her chest. When Nathan left at dusk, Thomas Maddox watched him ride north until the darkness absorbed him. Then he looked at Florence. "Good man," he said simply. "Yes," Florence said, "he is." November brought cold down from the north, and the cattle moved, and Nathan drove his herd to the winter pastures with 3 days of long, hard riding that left his men, as he put it with characteristic understatement, somewhat tired. Florence helped organize food for the drive's return, spending a full day in Mrs. Harker's kitchen preparing enough to feed 7 hungry men. And when the crew came in at dusk on the 3rd day, she was there on the porch when Nathan dismounted, and the look he gave her when he saw her standing there was something she would keep for the rest of her life. He was tired and dirty, and he had a new cut on his jaw from a branch that had caught him in the dark, and his coat was stiff with trail dust, and he stood looking at her for a moment with the kind of unguarded expression that exhaustion sometimes strips a person down to. And then he said, quietly enough that only she heard it, "You have no idea how good it is to see you standing there." "I think I have some idea," she said, and stepped forward, and without either of them making a particular decision about it. His arms went around her and she leaned into him, dust and all, and held on, and it was the first time they had held each other, and it felt nothing like a beginning. It felt like a recognition. They stayed like that for a moment, on the porch, with the horses stamping tiredly behind them, and the men drifting around them with the practiced discretion of people who understand that certain moments deserve not to be observed, and the first real cold of the winter settling in around them both. Later, when the men had been fed and the horses seen to, and Mrs. Harker had retired to her quarters in the back of the house, Nathan and Florence sat by the fire in the main room with coffee growing cold beside them, and talked for 2 hours about nothing and everything. He asked her what she wanted, not about him and not about anything specific, just in general, what Florence Maddox wanted from the life in front of her. She thought about it honestly. She wanted the land, she said, or something like it, the particular relationship with a place that comes from working it and knowing it through all its seasons. She wanted her father comfortable and close while he was with her, because she knew he would not always be. She wanted to be useful in ways that were real, not decorative, not peripheral, but genuinely useful. She wanted, she said, after a moment of deciding to be fully honest, to be loved by someone who meant it without reservation and without performance, the way good things are done in good country. Nathan listened to all of this. Then he said quietly, "I can offer you all of those things. I want to offer you all of those things. I want you to know that what I feel for you is exactly the kind of thing you described, without reservation and without performance. "Nathan," she said. "I know it is fast," he said. "It has been 4 months, I know that. But I am 32 years old and I have been in love before and I know what it is when it arrives, and I am not interested in waiting to say it when the thing is already true. I love you, Florence." The fire crackled between them. Outside, the November wind moved through the mesquites with a sound like the turning of pages. "I love you," she said. "I have known it for a while. I was waiting for you to say it first because I was not sure of the timing, but it has been true for a while." "A while," he said, and something lit in his face. "Since the cottonwoods," she said. "Since the spring." He reached across the space between them and took her face in both hands, very gently, and looked at her for a moment with the full intensity of a man who is not afraid of what he feels. And then he kissed her, softly and entirely seriously, the way that a thing that has been meant to happen feels when it finally does. She rode home much later than she should have, under a sky full of stars, and with the cold cutting through her coat and Clementine moving in a good steady walk she could trust in the dark. And she was not cold at all because something inside her was running warm with everything that had happened, the full extraordinary ordinariness of it. A man on a porch, and a fire and words said honestly in a way that changed the air. December arrived, and with it, the particular severity of a Panhandle winter, which was not the heavy snowfall of the northern states but a dry, relentless cold that came in on winds capable of cutting through anything but the most serious insulation. Nathan came to the Maddox property twice that month, riding through weather that would have kept sensible people inside, and Florence opened the door each time to find him on the porch with cold-reddened ears and the simple, satisfied look of a man who has made a reasonable trade of comfort for company. Thomas Maddox by now treated Nathan with an ease that was its own kind of statement, calling him by his first name and asking his opinion on things, and accepting his presence in the house as unremarkable, which from Thomas was high praise. It was on one of these December visits, during a quiet afternoon when the wind had briefly relented, and a thin winter sun was making an honest effort at the yard, that Nathan said he had something to ask. They were sitting at the kitchen table with coffee and the remains of lunch between them, and Florence's father had excused himself with the transparent tactfulness of a man who has recognized a moment and chosen to absent himself from it, and they were alone. Nathan put his coffee down and looked at her, and she saw the thing on his face that she had come to read as clearly as handwriting, the deliberateness that meant something mattered. "I want to marry you," he said. "I have been wanting to say it for weeks. I want to ask your father's permission, which I will do after I have asked you, because it seems to me that your answer is the one that determines everything, and asking him first would be placing his opinion above yours, which is not the order I believe things should go in." Florence looked at him across the table. Through the window behind him, the thin winter sun was laying itself across the yard in pale bars, and a mockingbird was singing in the mesquite near the fence, singing the mixed-up symphony of borrowed songs that mockingbirds make, a little of everything it has ever heard. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you, Nathan." He let out a breath that she realized he had been holding, and she laughed because the image of this steady, certain man holding his breath over her answer was so entirely human and so entirely dear to her. "I was not entirely sure," he admitted. "Yes, you were," she said. "Maybe a little," he said, and she laughed again, and he smiled, and they sat in that bright winter kitchen with the mockingbird singing outside and the coffee growing cold and everything settled between them in the best possible way. He spoke to Thomas Maddox that afternoon, honestly and directly, man to man, but not in a way that treated Florence as property to be transferred, which would have been the more common approach of the time, and which Nathan seemed to understand was not how Thomas Maddox would want it done, not for his daughter. He said he was asking for Thomas's blessing rather than his permission, and he said it with a clarity that made Thomas Maddox look at him with an expression that was not quite emotion, but was adjacent to it. Thomas gave his blessing readily and shook Nathan's hand and said he was glad, and then excused himself again, and Florence heard him, through the wall, sitting down rather heavily in the chair in his bedroom, and she thought that what she heard was not sadness but something else, a kind of release, a man setting down a weight he had been carrying since the winter of 1875. They were married in March of 1883, on a Saturday when the earliest hint of spring had pushed through the brown grass, and a few scattered wildflowers had begun their cautious appearance along the creek banks. Small, brave, yellow things that the cold had not quite finished with, but that had decided to appear anyway. The wedding was held at the small Baptist church in Harlow, which held 70 people comfortably, and held 112 for Nathan and Florence Bailey's wedding, because a good wedding in a small community is a thing that people are reluctant to miss. Florence wore a dress that had been her mother's, altered and freshened by a woman in town who had a fine hand with a needle, ivory-colored with small blue embroidered details at the collar and cuffs that had been Margaret Maddox's touch, and that Florence had chosen to leave exactly as they were. She carried wildflowers from the creek bank, those same small yellow ones that had decided the cold was not going to stop them, tied with a ribbon from Mrs. Harker's notions box. Nathan waited at the front of the church and watched her walk toward him with the kind of attention that excludes everything else from the field of vision, entirely focused. And when she reached him and he took her hand, she felt his fingers close around hers with the same deliberate, careful warmth that she had first noticed under the cottonwood trees by the spring. The ceremony was conducted by the Reverend Samuel Holt, who kept it honest and unshowy, which suited both of them. And when Nathan said, "I do," he said it in the same voice he used for everything true, without inflation or ceremony, just the plain fact of it. Florence said, "I do," and meant the whole of what those two words were standing in for, not just the agreement but the entirety of the year behind them and the years she intended to put in front of it. All the mornings and the work and the honest words and the hands at the spring and the fire in December, and every ordinary and extraordinary thing she intended to share with this man for as long as she lived. They walked out of the church into the March afternoon, with the small community around them, offering the kind of celebration that people in difficult country offer when there is something worth celebrating, which is to say enthusiastically and with considerable food. Tables had been set up in the churchyard, contributed by various members of the congregation, and loaded with things that people had brought because that was how community expressed itself in a place where resources were shared or gone without. And there was music from a fiddle player named Amos Worth, who was 70 years old, and had been playing at every occasion of note in Harlow County since before most of the people present had been born. Thomas Maddox danced with his daughter once, slowly, to a tune Amos Worth played for them specifically, an old waltz that had been Margaret Maddox's favorite, and Florence felt the rare extraordinary thing of her father holding her in a moment that reached backward and forward simultaneously, honoring what had been and welcoming what was coming. Nathan watched them dance, and his face was the open, honest face of a man who is exactly where he wants to be. The spring of 1883 was the spring of beginning the work of a shared life. Florence moved into the Bailey Ranch house, which involved a practical reorganization of things that two people negotiate with varying degrees of grace, and they managed it with good humor and the kind of ongoing conversation that makes the difference between a household and a home. Thomas Maddox stayed at the Maddox property, which Florence insisted on maintaining rather than selling, and which Nathan agreed was the right call because the land itself was sound, and because Thomas was not the kind of man who would thrive without his own ground under him. They rode to see him every Sunday, sometimes Nathan alone if Florence had other demands, sometimes both of them, and Thomas met these visits with the pleasure of a man who has the best of both arrangements, his daughter near and his solitude intact. Florence discovered quickly that running a ranch the size of the Bailey spread was a different scale of work than she had managed before, but she was not a woman who was frightened by scale. She learned what she needed to learn and asked the questions that needed asking and was not embarrassed by not knowing things, which was the quality Nathan had observed from the beginning and which served her as well here as it had everywhere else. Mrs. Harker, who might have been territorial about the domestic operations of a household she had managed alone for 3 years, turned out to be not territorial at all, but instead something closer to relieved, and she and Florence developed a working relationship that became genuine friendship over the course of that first year. Nathan's cowboys, all 7 of them, took the adjustment of a woman's permanent presence in the household with varying speeds of accommodation. Cooper Reese, the young man from Mississippi who had done his recalibrating at the fence repair back in October, was the quickest to arrive at normal, treating Florence with the matter-of-fact respect he gave to competence wherever he found it. The older men were slower but steady. By summer, there was not one of them who did not tip his hat to Florence Bailey with a genuine respect that had been earned rather than assigned. Summer brought the heat again and the work of it, and also something else. Florence knew before she was entirely certain, the way women sometimes know, and then she was certain, and she told Nathan on a Tuesday evening in late June when the supper things were cleared and they were sitting on the porch in the last of the light. He went very still when she said it. Then he turned and looked at her, and she saw something move across his face that was too large for one expression, and he said nothing for a moment, only reached for her hand. "Florence," he said finally, his voice carrying everything words are sometimes too small to hold. "Yes," she said simply, answering what he had not asked. He brought her hand to his lips and held it there for a moment, and she looked out at the land in the evening light, the grass moving in the slight wind, the first stars finding their places in the deepening sky, and felt the full and extraordinary weight of what was coming toward them. The pregnancy was straightforward by the standards of the time and the place, which is to say it was hard work, as everything in that country was, but uncomplicated in the medical sense, which was what mattered most. Florence continued to work through it because she was not a woman who took to being managed, and Nathan walked the line between concern and respect with the careful attention of a man who understood which side of it Florence needed him to stay on. He worried, she knew. He worried in the quiet, persistent way of a man who has lost someone before, who knows that the world does not guarantee outcomes, who has stood at a grave already and carries that knowledge as part of his permanent equipment. She did not tell him not to worry. She told him she was strong and careful, and that she would tell him immediately if anything felt wrong, and she kept all 3 of those promises. Thomas Maddox came to the ranch for the last weeks of the pregnancy and slept in the spare room, because Florence wanted him near, and because Nathan wanted whatever Florence wanted. He chopped wood and mended things and read to her in the evenings from the books on the shelf, which turned out to include several he had not read and genuinely wanted to. And the 3 of them spent those last waiting weeks in a kind of suspended warmth that Florence would later think of as one of the better times of her life. The baby came in late February of 1884, in the 2nd year of their marriage, on a night when the wind was down, and the cold had settled into a clean quiet rather than its usual abrasion, and he arrived with a degree of opinion about the proceedings that announced clearly that he had inherited the family tendency toward strong views. Nathan Bailey was in the next room for most of it, from which location he could be heard occasionally asking Mrs. Harker questions that she answered in a brisk and practical tone that suggested she had managed fathers-in-waiting before and found them manageable. When Florence held her son for the first time, she was exhausted in a way that went all the way down through every layer, and still she felt, underneath the exhaustion, something so enormous and quiet that it seemed to fill the room without taking up any particular space. She looked at the small red face and the astonishing fact of his fingers and the way he breathed with his whole body the way new things do. Nathan came in and stood beside the bed and looked at his son, and then at Florence and could not, for a moment, say anything at all, which was so unlike him that she reached up and took his hand, and he sat on the edge of the bed, and they stayed like that for a while, all three of them, in the quiet room with the winter outside, and everything changed. They named him James Thomas Bailey, for Nathan's father and Florence's father both, which made Thomas Maddox stand in the kitchen the next morning and look out the window for a long time with a quality of stillness that was different from his usual stillness, the stillness of a man who has been given something he did not expect and is taking time to understand what it is. The years that followed were the years of building and growing and the ordinary, extraordinary work of a shared life. The ranch prospered, not through luck but through the consistent, intelligent management of two people who were each other's best resource and knew it. Florence became increasingly involved in the operational decisions of the ranch, not by claiming it or asserting it, but simply by being present and capable. And Nathan included her not because he felt he should, but because her thinking was among the best he had access to, and he would have been foolish to exclude it. Rio, the bay stallion with the white stockings and the wandering disposition, turned out to be an exceptional horse under consistent handling. Florence worked with him herself, learning his habits and his language, and Rio repaid her with a loyalty that was the particular wholehearted kind that horses offer when they have decided to trust completely. He became her horse entirely, the question of the gift resolved simply by the fact of how things were, and when she rode out on the ranch it was always Rio beneath her, the same horse that had come wandering out of the morning and changed the course of her life. The town of Harlow grew over those years slowly, as the Panhandle drew more settlers and the railroad's extension pushed the edges of the known world further in each direction. The Bailey Ranch became something of a landmark in the county, known for good cattle and fair dealing, and the family that ran it. Nathan served a term on the county commission, reluctantly, because he did not love politics but understood that someone had to do it and better someone honest. Florence taught reading on Saturday mornings to the children of ranch hands and small farmers who could not attend the school in town regularly, which she did in the kitchen of the ranch house with the same no-nonsense warmth she brought to everything. Their second child arrived in the spring of 1886, a girl they named Margaret Clara Bailey, for Florence's mother and Nathan's first wife both, which was not an awkward decision but an honest one, the kind that acknowledges that love does not cancel love but adds to it. Margaret was from the beginning a different temperament from James, quieter and more observant, with Florence's gray eyes and Nathan's way of sitting still and taking things in before deciding what they meant. Thomas Maddox remained at the Maddox property and remained himself, aging with the lean dignity of a man who has decided that getting old is something to be done with the same character applied to everything else. He was at the Bailey Ranch every Sunday without fail and sometimes on other days, and James Bailey, who called him Grandpa Tom, followed him around the property with an absorption that was the most sincere form of admiration, and that Thomas received with a gruffness that was the most sincere form of pleasure. Florence still rode Rio out to the south, sometimes, on mornings, when she wanted to be alone with the land and her thoughts. She would ride out to where the South Creek bed ran, and sometimes she would stop there and look back across the miles toward the ranch and think about the morning in July of 1882, when she had been riding alone in the early dark and heard a sound that did not belong, and had turned in her saddle to see a bay horse coming toward her with his head hung low and his whole body carrying the question of where he was supposed to be. She thought about how she had tied his broken reins to her saddle horn with her spare rope and turned north, because the right thing and the sensible thing were the same thing, and how she had ridden 8 miles in the morning heat to a ranch she had never visited to return something to its owner. She thought about a man in a corral with a hammer who had looked up and recalibrated something. She thought about a porch and water so cold it came from underground, and a conversation that had moved from practical to something warmer without either of them directing it there. Keep the horse, he had said. Come back tomorrow. And she had. And she had. One evening in the autumn of 1887, 5 years into their marriage, Florence and Nathan sat on the wide porch of the ranch house in the cooling dark after the children were in bed, in the comfortable silence of two people who have nothing to prove to each other and no performance left to maintain, just the genuine presence of one beside the other. The stars were doing their excessive best above them, and somewhere out in the pasture Rio was moving. She could hear the soft sound of him, the particular rhythm of a horse at ease in his ground. "Nathan," she said. He said, not quite a word, just the sound of a man who is content and present. "I was thinking about the morning I brought Rio back," she said. "Were you?" He shifted slightly in his chair, the wood creaking. She could feel his attention turn toward her without him moving. "I was thinking about the fact that I was going to say no to the horse," she said. "When you offered it, I had my answer mostly prepared. I was going to be polite and practical and decline and ride home, and that was going to be the end of it." "But you did not," he said. "I did not," she agreed. "Because you told me to come back tomorrow." He was quiet for a moment. The night insects were in full voice, and the wind moved through the grass with its familiar sound, the sound of this place, their place. "I was not thinking about the horse," Nathan said then quietly. "When I said that, I was thinking about wanting you to come back. The horse was just the excuse I had available." Florence smiled in the dark. "I know," she said. "You knew then." "I suspected," she said. "I thought maybe I was wrong." "You were not wrong," he said. "No," she agreed. "I was not wrong." He reached across the space between their chairs and found her hand, and she turned her palm up to meet his. And they sat like that in the autumn night with the stars above them and the land all around them, and the children asleep inside, and everything built from that single early morning 5 years ago running through their hands like a current, steady and alive. She thought about her mother, who had not lived to see this. She thought about Clara Bailey, who had loved this ranch and this man and was gone into the long quiet. She thought about the buffalo wallows Nathan had shown her, and the cliff swallows at the limestone overhang, and the spring that ran clear even in drought. She thought about all the things that persist, and all the things that pass, and all the things that a person finds when they stop and turn in the saddle at the right moment and look toward a sound coming out of the morning. "I love you," she said simply in the dark. "I love you," he said just as simply. It was not the first time they had said it, and it would not be the last, and it was never, in all the years of their life together, less entirely true than it was in the moment of its saying. That was the nature of it. That was the remarkable ordinary nature of what had grown between them from that first morning, from a wandering horse and a woman who believed in returning what was not hers, and a man who had looked up from his work and known, in the way that certain things are simply known, that something worth having had arrived. The next morning Florence rose before dawn, as was still her habit, and went out to the corral. Rio came to the fence immediately, as he always did, his large dark eyes finding her in the pre-dawn gray, his breath coming in small clouds in the autumn chill. She fed him the bit of apple she had brought and scratched behind his ears, and he leaned into her hand with the full, uncomplicated trust that had been there from the beginning, from the moment he had walked out of the dark toward her on the creek bed, and accepted her company as if he had been looking for her specifically. Maybe he had been, she thought. Or maybe that was the kind of story you told afterward to make sense of the way things had gone. Maybe it did not matter which was true, because the outcome was the same either way. A horse that wandered, a woman who returned it, a man who said come back tomorrow. Everything else, all 5 years of it and all the years still ahead, had grown from that. She heard the screen door and turned to see Nathan crossing the yard toward her in the early gray, his coat half fastened against the cold, his hair uncombed, the face she knew better than any other face in the world relaxed and unhurried in the morning. He came and stood beside her at the fence, and Rio shifted his attention from Florence to Nathan and back to Florence in the way he always did, dividing his loyalty equitably. "James is awake," Nathan said. "He is asking if he can ride with Cooper today." "He can ask Cooper," Florence said. "If Cooper agrees, I agree." Nathan nodded. He looked out over the land in the early light, the grass running gray-gold toward the horizon, the sky beginning its slow work of turning from black to blue. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. It was that and so much more. It was every good morning in the accumulation of their life, all the ordinary beginnings of all the ordinary days that were extraordinary by virtue of being shared with the right person. It was the horse between them at the fence and the children inside the house and the land under their feet, and the long, astonishing future still ahead of them. Years of it, full years, all of it waiting in the turning sky. James Bailey did ride with Cooper Reese that day, and came home in the evening taller somehow with the pride of a 6-year-old, who has spent a day doing real work alongside real men. And he told his father about every moment of it at the supper table, with the particular fervor of a child who has experienced something important, and needs to make sure the adults in his life understand the full significance of it. Nathan listened with the complete attention he gave to things that mattered, which was the same attention he gave his son as he gave his cattle and his land and his wife. And Florence watched them across the table and felt the full, deep rightness of everything. Margaret, who was 18 months old and had opinions about the pace of conversations that were not including her, contributed to the supper table discussion by banging her spoon emphatically against her bowl, and looking around at the assembled adults with an expression that suggested she felt her own contributions were being undervalued, which made everyone laugh, the clean, unself-conscious laughter of a family at ease. Mrs. Harker, who ate with them always now, not as an employee at a remove but as the something between family and friend that she had become over the years, shook her head at Margaret with an affection that was indistinguishable from love. After supper, Nathan read to the children in the parlor, James on one side and Margaret on the other, tucked into him with the complete physical confidence of children who have never known anything but safety and warmth in these arms. Florence stood in the doorway for a while listening, not because she needed to monitor, but because the sight of it was something she never wanted to take for granted. Later, after the children were asleep and Mrs. Harker had retired and the house was quiet around them, Nathan and Florence sat by the fire and talked about the ranch's needs for the coming season, about a section of fence on the western boundary that would need replacing before spring, about a young cow that was not eating well and might need the farrier's attention before the weather turned, about a letter Nathan had received from a man in Austin who was interested in purchasing some of their stock. They talked about these things with the ease of two people whose practical lives are fully interwoven, and the conversation moved between the mundane and the important and back again without seam, which was the nature of a life shared deeply. When the fire had burned down and they were ready to end the day, Nathan looked at her in the firelight, the comfortable, familiar face of a man who has nothing to conceal and nothing to perform, and said the thing he said often and meant every time. "I am grateful," he said. "For what in particular?" she asked, as she often did because she liked the answers. "For a horse that knew where he was going," Nathan said. Florence smiled. "Rio always did," she said, "even when he had no idea." She took his hand and they went together through the quiet house, past the closed doors of their children's rooms, past the window where the autumn moon was laying its light across the yard, past the shelf of books and the painting Clara had made of the canyon country, a painting Florence had come to love not in spite of what it represented but because of it, because it was a part of the true story of this place and the man who lived here, and she was part of the true story now too, as fully and permanently as the paint on the canvas. The land outside was enormous and dark and alive with the sounds of a Texas night, the insects and the wind, and the distant sound of the cattle, and somewhere out there Rio moving in the pasture under the moon, that beautiful wandering horse who had found his way to the right place at the right time, and in doing so had brought everything else into alignment. It was not magic, this life. It was better than magic. It was the thing that happens when honest people find each other and decide to do the hard and beautiful work of staying, and mean it, and do it, day after day, year after year, through heat and cold and the hard seasons and the generous ones, building something out of the basic materials of their own honesty and effort that is stronger than either of them could have built alone. Florence Bailey fell asleep that night with the sound of the wind in the grass and the warmth of her husband beside her, and the future settled ahead of them like the best kind of country, known in its general shapes but full of specific mornings still to come, all of them ahead, all of them hers. And in the pasture, under the enormous Texas sky, a bay horse with 4 white stockings moved through the grass at an easy walk, his head up now, not low and tired as it had been on that July morning 5 years ago, but up and alert and entirely at home, knowing exactly where he was and content at last to be exactly there.